All right, folks. Hello. I'm sorry not to be in the classroom with you today, but hopefully I can get my hip better enough that I'll be back in the classroom with you next week. Today, we're going to be talking about research-supported ways to slow population growth. So we've talked about some of this as we talk about other elements of population growth. We talked last week about the different ways in which we can think about whether use of resources or excess of number of people are the real environmental problem we need to worry about. And we saw that IPAT equation, where environmental impact is equal to the population times the affluence times the technology, helps us to think about that problem. But that sometimes each of those numbers can go up or down in ways that we don't necessarily expect. So remember that IPAT equation. But for today, we're going to be talking about if we do indeed want to slow population growth, how do we go about it? And we know, again, from last week, from what Hans Rosling told us in those videos, that, well, we have a certain amount of population growth built in. Because we have a lot of people in the 15 to 30-year-old age range around the world right now, in those global south countries, those developing countries, they're going to get to be people in the 31 to 45 age range and the 46 to 60-year-old age range. So that part of population growth is already built in because we have children who are going to become adults. I assume none of you out there are big on the idea of genocide, of going out and killing off people to slow down population growth, right? You want to think about addressing population growth from the direction of birth. You don't want to kill a bunch of people off. You don't want to have a big war just to make the population growth slow down. No, you want to do it in a compassionate, effective way, right? So to do that, we have to think about addressing it at the birth rate. So let's first look at what that looks like. If we want to address how population growth happens, we need to think about how it's already happened in some countries. So that means thinking about the demographic transition. So you read about that for today, the demographic transition model. And we have a model here of the demographic transition model to look at. And the first thing to know is that this model represents what happened in the United States and what happened in Europe and what's happened in a lot of countries in the global south too. And I'm going to use that phrase global south interchangeably with developing world. It means the same thing. Global south is kind of the more accepted phrase these days. Anyway, so in the global south, a lot of countries have already gone through this same transition that we in the United States and Europe have gone through, but some have not. And that's what we're talking about today. So how did places like Europe go through this demographic transition? Okay, well, let's first look at that blue area on the chart. So where the birth rate and death rate are close together up there at the top left. Okay, so we have a high birth rate and we have a high death rate. This is back before, say, 1900. Why are people dying off really fast? What do you think makes them die off? Well, lots of disease, tuberculosis, all kinds of gastrointestinal diseases where you get sick from bad food or from bad water. You get flu from nobody washing their hands. So everybody's dying at really high rates. And then around the 19th century into the 20th century, we start getting all these innovations that people start practicing. A lot of them have to do with health, with medical care, but a lot of them are pretty simple. So if you look over at the left-hand side, why are we starting to get declining death rates? Well, soap. People start using soap a whole lot. They wash their hands so that they don't spread whatever they're sick with to somebody else. That's, they use the bathroom and then they wash their hands. They make food and wash their hands. They sneeze and wash their hands. All of a sudden, using soap it's thought to be one of the biggest reasons for our decline in death rates. And we also started making sure we were drinking clean water sources. So sometimes that meant filtering our water. So that's what that image over there is, of a kind of a homemade filter for water. And we started cleaning up our sewage. So we weren't walking around next to the poured out toilet leavings of everybody that we've been living around. Old Europe, old United States, people used to take their chamber pots, which is where you pooped and peed at night, and they just poured out the window. And that would be all over the street, right? Or people had outhouses, but a lot of times in cities, you just had it poured all over the place. And so now what we've got instead is people are using toilets, and it's going into the toilet and it's getting sent out to a sewage treatment plant. And at the sewage treatment plant, the water gets cleaned and separated out, and then the water goes back into our water system after it's been cleaned, and usually back into a river or something like that. So those kinds of innovations of water, soap, cleaning up our sewage, those help to make a huge decline in the death rate. And then combined with the later addition of antibiotics, all of a sudden we had a whole lot more people surviving. So that's what we see is that death rate line, that blue line, declines all of a sudden because people just stop dying because we stop spreading so much disease. However, the birth rate stays up. Why does the birth rate stay up? Well, because people are not convinced that they're going to keep having enough children to help them with work. Give me one sec. So what that means is that even though people are not dying as fast, they're still having a lot of kids. So how do we get the number of kids to decline? Well, people start, first of all, they start to notice their kids are surviving. So they go, okay, I don't have to have 8 kids in order to ensure I have 3 or 4 kids to help out on the farm. But also, people start to move into the cities. And when they move into the cities, they find that it's more expensive to raise children. So people in the cities, also start having fewer and fewer children. So those kinds of things help the birth rate to decline. Women start getting an education. Women start going to work. That also means that the birth rate starts to decline. So all of those things lead to the decline of that green line that you see on the top of the blue section. And then as you see the green line decline, look at what has happened to the tan area, the population area. So we started with a low population when we had a high birth rate and a high death rate. And then when the death rate started to decline, the number of people starts to shoot up. But then when the birth rate starts to decline, we see that the population starts to level out. It takes a while. It still keeps going up, but then it starts to level out. And so that's what we've seen in the United States and in Europe, is that we've gotten the birth rates to decline. And in places like Russia and Japan, the birth rate is even negative. The fertility rate, we have fewer people being born than are replaced in the population, that are replacing the total population. So now all of a sudden we have a leveled out population or a just very slightly growing population. And so we want to see that same thing happen in the global south, in countries where it hasn't already happened. Okay, so let's first just walk through again what happened. So look at stage 1. We had a high birth rate, high death rate, and the natural increase of the population was stable or slow. Then the death rate falls in stage 2, but the birth rate stays high. So we quickly get population growth. So what we want to see in the global south is a stage 3 that in some places hasn't happened yet, where now the birth rate also starts to decline. And we're seeing that in a lot of countries in the global south. In Southeast Asia, in a lot of parts of Africa and countries, we are seeing a decline in the birth rate. But as we saw, places like Niger have not gotten there yet. So how can we get more countries to go to the stage 3, if that is indeed our goal? Okay, so let's take a look at how that can happen. To do that, first we need to remember that we've got a few more terms we have to know from that chart. So you should know what birth rate means. You should know death rate. And then zero population growth is where there are no more new people than there are people who are dying. So we get zero population growth when there is no increase in the number of people over time. And then we've mentioned this before, but the fertility rate is the number of babies born per woman. That's different from the birth rate, which is the number of babies born per so many thousand people. Okay, so just make sure you know those terms. Look back at the Robbins reading if you need to. And then we're going to talk about Bangladesh. And we're going to stop there for just a second.
Bangladesh is a country in South Asia that has made dramatic changes in both reducing fertility and increasing economic growth over the last 30 years. On the left axis of this trend graph, we have the average number of births per woman, which we call the fertility rate, and it goes from 0 up to about 6 children per woman. On the bottom axis, we have the gross national income per person, or GNI. This is in US dollars, and it is standardized for what a dollar can buy today in Bangladesh. On this bottom axis, we go from 0 over to $3,000. In 1980, the fertility rate, or average number of births per woman, in Bangladesh was about 6.5. The gross national income per person was only $310. Let's move forward in time and see what has changed. In 1983, Bangladesh expanded community distribution for family planning to more rural areas, and you see that fertility is dropping dramatically. In the 1990s, Bangladesh focused on integrating services for family planning and health. You see that right around 3 children per woman, the gross national income per person starts to increase dramatically. Now, in 2011, women in Bangladesh have about 2 children per woman, and the national income per person is almost $2,000. This means that while the average family in Bangladesh today has about 4 children fewer than their parents' generation, that family has about 6 times the purchasing power.
Okay, so you can see that things changed pretty substantially in Bangladesh. And she talks about some of the reasons why, but I want to talk about a few other things as well. So how did Bangladesh get this huge decline in fertility rate that is helping the population growth rate to decline and helping the population to start to level off? Well, one of the things is in this picture right here. So in this picture, you see a village woman who has been trained to train her villagers on how to get contraception, how to plan their families. So she's not a nurse, she's not a doctor, but the nurses and doctors in the country have gone out and trained women who live in the villages, who work alongside their neighbors and know their neighbors, to talk about this stuff. And that's because they found that they have a much bigger reach when there are people who really understand what it's like to live in the village and to experience what average women experience. So they've had huge success with educating people about family planning this way. And family planning includes talking about birth control, which we'll talk about in a minute. But another thing, as you can see on the bullet points on the left, is they've prioritized girls' education. Almost all of the girls in Bangladesh now go to primary school, which is a number you certainly cannot say about Niger, for example. So they've put a huge priority on getting girls and boys, but girls especially, into school, and now 97% of girls are getting an education at the primary level. They've also put a huge emphasis on reducing maternal and child mortality. So when women know that they're going to survive childbirth, when they know that their children are going to survive past the age of 5, which usually means they'll survive to adulthood, they are far more likely to be willing to have fewer children. So they'll take better care of their children, they'll take better care of themselves because they know they have that good health care. And then as the socioeconomic status of women increases, they also decrease their rate of birth. So as women have access to jobs, the birth rate declines. So all of these things together work together to help the population growth rate decline. And a bunch of studies have demonstrated this over and over again, that if you get a priority on girls' education, on health, especially preventing child mortality, and of course maternal mortality, and if you help women to get access to jobs and to income, then the population growth rate will decline. So this is, like I say, it's supported by lots and lots of research that this is the best way to go about getting the population growth rate to decline. Okay, so we know how to do it. Now, what does that end up looking like? Let's first take a look at how that has changed things across the world as these changes have started to happen in a lot of countries.
The number of babies born per woman has dropped across the world. Back in the year 1800, it was about 6 babies per woman in all regions. Then Europe changed like this. America followed, had a baby boom after the Second World War, and then dropped like this. In Asia, that drop came late, but was very fast. And in Africa, the number of babies per woman has continued quite high, but then during the last 30 years, the number of babies per woman is decreasing steadily in Africa. Now this is today. When the trends continue as they are expected, we will reach down to 2 babies born per woman during this century.
Okay, so good old Hans Rosling again, telling us what we can expect from the trends. He's a demographer, he's somebody who has studied the way that population changes and what causes population to change. So that's why I keep showing you his videos. He gives some really nice, concise answers. Unfortunately, he passed away last year, but his website still exists, and his daughter and some other people are maintaining it. So anyway, we can see that population growth is expected to decline. In order to ensure that the number of children being had continues to decline, we mentioned that one of the key pieces is family planning, so having access to birth control. So let's talk about what that looks like for the developing world or the global south here a little bit. Okay, first, we know that in the United States, a lot of people use these two forms of birth control. That's because a lot of us have access to medical care. We are able to go and pick up medications from the pharmacy on a regular basis. Most of us live fairly close to a pharmacy if we live in a town. Like if we live in DeLand, we're within walking distance to several pharmacies just at Stetson. So these are things that we can access easily once we get somebody to prescribe them for us. These are not necessarily over-the-counter things, but most of us have access to somebody that will give us a prescription for them. And so they're very straightforward things. And so, for example, the birth control patch, which is 91% effective, you can just stick it on your arm and it will work for a week and you don't have to think about it. And then there's the birth control pill, also 91% effective. That one you have to remember to take at the same time every day. So sometimes that one can be a challenge for people who are, stressed out on an intense schedule or something like that. But for the United States, these solutions often work well. However, for the global south, these can have problems. Like they need to not be too hot. So if you have a place with no air conditioning or refrigeration, these might not be the best solutions. If you are a stressed out mom who's taking care of 8 kids, it may be hard to remember to take a birth control pill, and so that might not be the best solution. So what are some better solutions for some places in the developing world, in the global south? Well, one that's been used a lot is the condom. And part of the reason the condom has been used a lot is it also is good at preventing sexually transmitted diseases like HIV/AIDS. So for example, in the southern part of Africa, there has been a lot of HIV/AIDS in recent years, and so condoms have really been encouraged as a way to help prevent the spread of HIV. It also helps prevent the spread of most other sexually transmitted diseases. However, for pregnancy, there's some downsides, I should say. So it's only 85% effective. It's a physical barrier, so it can get holes, it can tear, it can just wear out if it's old. For example, the material kind of breaks down. And so condoms are good, but they're not the most effective thing for preventing pregnancy. If you're trying to prevent pregnancy and prevent STDs, they're kind of the best option. Condoms or female condoms, which are the things that the women can choose to put inside themselves. But again, not the best thing in the heat. They have to be replaced pretty often. So are there some better options for the global south? Well, 2 have sometimes worked in a lot of places. The IUD has been used some in places in the global south. It's great in that it's 99% effective at preventing pregnancy. You can wear it for literally years, but you have to have a doctor insert it. So it has some more medical costs than some other things tend to. Even in the global south, it can be more expensive than some other options. And so oftentimes it doesn't end up getting used much, partly because it can be kind of expensive. On the other hand, one that does get used more in the global south is the birth control implant. So that one, you get a little stick implanted in your arm that has hormones in it, and that's, again, 99% effective. And so that one can work pretty well for women oftentimes. It, again, lasts for years, so they don't have to go back to the doctor all the time. And it's not very likely to cause women problems, which IUDs have a small chance of causing some problems where people have to go in and get the IUD removed for an infection or something like that. Not very high rate, but it happens a bit. Birth control implants can be somewhat better in some ways. So both of these, 99% effective, they've worked pretty well in the developing world. What else? One of the ones that I've often heard praised in places where there is at least refrigeration to help keep the shots, kind of protected, is the birth control shot. Now, you'll notice if we go back and forth here, the birth control implant can last up to 5 years. The shot only lasts 3 months. So a woman has to go back to the clinic every 3 months to get a shot, but it's not very expensive. So there's that advantage. If you're talking about the global south, expense matters. And so the shot can be a really useful one. However, it is only 94% effective as compared to the 99% effective of the implant. So all of these options can really help to prevent pregnancy in the global south when women want to choose to control how many children they have. And since women have gone, you saw in places like Bangladesh from having over 6 children per woman to only over 2 children per woman, it's partly because they have access to these kinds of birth control measures that they've been able to do that. And along with these birth control measures, as one of your videos mentioned, that also tends to decrease the abortion rate drastically. There are far fewer people who find that they have unwanted pregnancies because they have effective birth control. So birth control has been found to be one of the 3 key pillars to helping birth rates decline in the developing world. So access with education, including general girls' education, but also specific education about family planning options, those things together with economic opportunities for women have been shown time after time in research to be what is needed to help the fertility rate decline in a country. So we know that. So when we're starting to talk about our options for the global south, for helping to ensure that our global population growth rate levels off, what I'm telling you is research has shown us we already know what to do. It just takes the funding to make it happen. All right, folks, I look forward to talking with you again on Thursday. And please, please let me know if you have any questions about anything. I'm glad to talk about it. All right, we'll see you on Thursday.